This is one of the important life lessons. Don't mix up your pages before you come out. My name is David Ellwood, and I want to welcome all of you to this very important and I hope very productive discussion tonight. I'm the dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the title of tonight's talk is Challenges to Democracy, the Future of Policing. And our focus is very much going to be on solutions, about ideas, about looking to the future. Here at the Kennedy School, we spend a lot of time trying to understand the nature of the problems and the like that we face. But ultimately, our goal is to work across boundaries and to think about ideas and solutions. And we have with us here tonight three truly exceptional people, each of whom has been engaged quite actively and visibly in finding solutions to the kinds of crises and the loss of legitimacy that is so often felt among particularly the African American community, but other communities and many of our major police departments. And of course, the tragic events with the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and so many others has been a lightning rod for all of us and for many people very, very personal. I did want to highlight, this is just one of many activities, and those of you who are interested, I hope, are aware that there's also a series of discussions next week called The Week That Shaped the Future of Policing, where folks in by the Kennedy School and members of student government will bring together a group of people in a series of evenings, and the hope is to put together concrete recommendations to pass along to President Obama's commission about policing the 21st century, co-chaired, by the way, by one of our guests here. So I also want to thank the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, the Ash Center for Democratic Governance, the Criminal Justice Program, and certainly the Institute of Politics for all the work to put this together. And I especially want to thank our guests, several of whom have flown long distances in order to be here. And it isn't for the weather, I am sure. So I want to briefly introduce our guests, but mostly to get right into discussion. To my immediate left here is Mayor Annise Parker. She was elected Houston's 61st mayor in 2010, one of only two women to hold the city's highest elected office, and one of the very few openly gay mayors of large cities. She's also chair of the Criminal and Social Justice Committee at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. By all accounts, she's doing a remarkable job. Re-elected, three times now? Two-year term. That's another tough thing for a mayor. In 2010, she was named to the Time 100, meaning the 100 most powerful people in the world. She spent many years in the service to people of Houston, 6 years as city councilor, 6 years as controller. She's held the offices of controller, city councilor, and mayor, first person to do that. She's a member of President Obama's task force on climate preparedness, chairs the Conference of Mayors, Criminal Social Justice Committee, as I mentioned, and a variety of other things. She's also, one of the most interesting features is she taught in the police academy for 5 years prior to becoming mayor. So she's someone that really has crossed these boundaries over and over. And just last December, just a few months ago, she was ranked as the top U.S. mayor in a worldwide competition for the best mayors, and in the top 10, number 7, I believe, worldwide mayor for the World Mayor Prize. So congratulations on that. Next, we have Commissioner Charles Ramsey, who was appointed Philadelphia Police Commissioner in 2008. And he leads the 4th largest police department in the nation with 6,400 sworn and 800 civilian members. He co-chairs the President Obama's task force on 21st century policing, and he's really very much been in the forefront of innovative policing strategies, evidence-based initiatives, organizational accountability, an important word for tonight, and neighborhood-based programs while leading organizational change in the departments. He's previously served as DC Commissioner as well. He currently serves as president of both the Police Executive Research Forum and the Major Cities Police Chiefs Association. He is the only law enforcement professional to hold both these positions simultaneously. He, too, has received numerous awards, among them the John Penrith Leadership Award from the FBI, Major Cities Chief National Executive Institute, Leadership in Policing Award from the Police Executive Research Forum, and the Innovations in American Government Award from the Ash Center here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Ramsey. Third, we have Professor Phillip Goff. He's a visiting scholar here at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and he's on the faculty at UCLA. He's an expert in race, policing, and intersectional identity. In that capacity, he's been recruited as a researcher and a consultant to police departments around the country, a role he plays enthusiastically. Indeed, he's done work with Houston, and I think you grew up in Philadelphia, is that right? So lots of connections. His research investigates the possibility that both contextual explanations play underexplored role in producing racial inequity, but rather than focusing on racial attitudes that are internally individual, he often examines ways in which environmental factors can produce racially disparate outcomes. Quite strikingly, he's the co-founder with Captain Tracy Cassie of the Center for Policing Equity, which is a research consortium that does promote transparency and accountability by facilitating innovative research collaborations between police departments and scholars. So again, it's hard to imagine a better group for us to think this through. So I guess I'd actually like to start in the middle here with Commissioner and ask you, Commissioner Ramsey, these horrible events that we've been seeing and the highly visible loss of credibility in some communities and police departments, maybe it's never been there, but how do you explain what we've been seeing? Even as you've been part of the commission and so forth, what have you seen around the country? Help us understand the basic problem here we're facing.
Well, I think what you see is the result of something that's been simmering beneath the surface for quite some time. It really does boil down to trust and legitimacy, which you mentioned earlier. And certainly the Ferguson incident, the New York City, Cleveland, as well as others, really served as a spark to bring it to the surface. This is something I've been in policing for a long time. I'm in my 47th year in the business. So I've seen these kinds of things come and go, but this is a little different. I've not seen the kind of widespread protests that we've had recently. I've not really seen the level of concern and even anger on the part of people toward police directly, not toward some other event that may be going on, you know, like the Vietnam War, for an example, when I was a young rookie cop and we were kind of in the middle of it. But this is really directed at police. So I see this as a huge challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity for change in our profession. You know, we've been engaged in community policing in general for the last 20 plus years, but clearly there are some communities that we have not reached. And, and we need to establish communication. We need to begin the process of building trust because it's just not there in many of our communities, unfortunately. It's not everyone, but it's a significant number. And we need to listen and hear what people are saying to us and make the changes necessary in order to gain the kind of respect, the kind of trust, the legitimacy that we need to have in order to be effective in building safe neighborhoods. And we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm excited about what's going on now because I think this is a great opportunity to have the kind of change that's really needed.
How do you do that? How do you build trust?
I think it starts with communication. It starts with building relationships. People at some point in time have to listen to one another. And I think that's really key. And, you know, we need to take a real look at ourselves and some of the strategies that perhaps we've used. You know, when I hear people talking about, for an example, the broken windows and something that since 1982, when it was written, more and more departments began to engage in the kind of activities that deal with lower level offenses, believing that it's going to, you know, prevent larger offenses from occurring in the future. And there's some, certainly in my opinion, I believe that there's, you know, some evidence to show that that can in fact happen. But I think the problem for me is that whereas we had a strategy to go in and deal with these kinds of disorder-type crimes that really destroy quality of life in a neighborhood, but we didn't have an effective strategy to deal with once the window was fixed. Once that broken window began to get repaired, you can't keep doing the same thing. And so our inflexibility, if you will, to start making adjustments, to start building community, start community building, so that people, if you want that window to stay repaired, then the community has to take ownership, and they have to make the necessary adjustments in order to be able to maintain whatever gains were made. And we didn't do that across the board. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about policing across the board. Maybe there are some agencies that did. We didn't. I mean, I didn't start thinking about it until after this began. And it started, what are we really doing? And do we still need to do the same kinds of things that we were doing before? How do we build that capacity within communities? How do we, during the course of CompStat, everybody wanted to be New York. Everybody wanted to have a 90% drop in homicides. And there was a lot of, police chiefs and political leaders and so forth that wanted the same thing. Fine. But we started concentrating more on the dots on the map and where it was occurring and what we needed to do than we did with the real human interaction and getting to know people. We kind of pulled away from some of the things that have been successful in community policing, building those relationships and working together to solve problems. We became very data-driven. But, behind every icon on a map is a human being whose life's been changed because of crime, and we can't lose sight of that. It's a neighborhood in peril. There's people who are out there suffering. We don't need to add to that. We need to have that human touch, and I think we've made some, we've stumbled along the way a bit, and I think that's kind of led to where we are today, but it's fixable stuff.
Professor Goff, you've been working with police departments. You've been on this issue long before the events. Indeed, you came here to be on leave, and it's been instead a very, very potent and productive time, but I'm sure very demanding. How do you see these sorts of issues, and where do you look for solutions?
Well, I think the commissioner's right that we're at a different space than we've ever been at when it comes to community policing, and particularly communities of color, non-white communities. But when I start thinking about how best to make sense of what it is that we've seen since August 9th of this summer, I see it as an organizational piece. There's a data piece. We've been doing evidence-based reduction in crime for a long time, but we haven't been doing evidence-based approaches to social justice. You've got the organizational piece is that it's very difficult for managers to hold individual officers accountable for their behavior if you don't have something you can measure. And so stops became something you could measure. The cops on dots became the thing that you could measure. But past that, how do you do something beyond arresting your way out of the problem? There have been a whole bunch of different things, and I can put a scatter plot together for it. But when I think about what's at the core of it, I kind of end up getting biblical. So you'll forgive me. But when I think about what the problem was with Michael Brown's shooting death and the aftermath, and I think about the problem in the Eric Garner death and the aftermath, I don't think about the bullet through a head, and I don't think about a chokehold. I think about vision and a crisis of vision. So forgive me, again, I'm a social scientist. I'll get into numbers later, but my thinking is Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. And I'm not trying to get high and mighty, but I do want to explain. I love the passage not just because it's true, but because it ends up being a mistranslation of the Hebrew. It doesn't say perish. In the Hebrew, it says parah, which means to be shaken loose. Where there is no vision, the people are shaken loose. And how that relates back to what it is that I see when I go and talk to line officers and when I'm crunching data is that we don't, as a nation, beyond just a set of police departments, we don't, as a nation, have a way to see, to make visible the humanity of the people that are living in these neighborhoods. And as a result, we don't have public policy that is responsive to that. So we see these things that look like images of when our parents' generations, or when our generations, if it's our kids looking at it. But it's as if it's out of time, as if it's not a continuation. But if you walk in those neighborhoods and you talk to those folks, if you talk to the beat officers and the first line officers that have been there for quite some time, they'll say, we've seen this happening for a while. But nobody else has. So when we report back up, when we give you the numbers that become dots on a map, the full story of the humanity of the people that live in these neighborhoods hasn't been available to the police department or to the schools or to the employers, or to the housing authorities, the Better Business Bureau. And as a result, these things come as a shock to the system as if they're outside of our values. And so there's many things that we can do. We have an amazing opportunity because there's so much momentum behind this, and we do see this as counter to our values. But I think we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we don't go back and fix the kind of original sin of this, which is, to me, we have not been positioned to see the humanity of the people that live in these neighborhoods for some time. And when I say we, I don't mean researchers, I don't mean law enforcement, I mean we as a nation. The best thing we can do to move forward is to stop being surprised when we see it. Because no one in Ferguson was surprised. That, I think, is part of the point in sort of both the historical stuff that I'm doing and the statistical stuff I'm doing. The stories of these neighborhoods is that they were not surprised. They were just surprised that everybody else was.
Mayor, as you mentioned, as I mentioned, you taught in the police academy. You've been a mayor for a long time. You're an award-winning mayor. How do you think about this, and how do you think about it in the context where obviously there's a whole lot of things that go on in poor neighborhoods and other neighborhoods? How do you think about what's the problem? And you've been pretty aggressive and thoughtful in your solutions.
Well, obviously, the solution starts before there's a crisis. And Commissioner Ramsey mentioned community. I would say it's community, it's communication, and it's consistency. You can have an all-white police force patrolling and policing an all-black community, which is in essence what Ferguson had. And you can do it successfully. But you can only do it successfully if those officers understand what's going on in the neighborhood, if they know who the influencers are, if they have relationships, if they've built their own networks. And now I think it's important to have a police force that looks like the community, and the city of Houston's been going in that way for a long time. But just looking like the community isn't where you need to be. You have to have that communication. And then there's another piece that's lacking, and that is that for most communities, they really don't have an understanding of what real policing's like. I mean, you know, we all have a steady diet of cop shows on TV, and you know, in an hour everything's solved, and it's all resolved. But I don't think for most community members, they have a real understanding of the difficulties of policing. And you have to understand that when a police officer encounters a citizen, it is almost always a negative interaction. Almost always. You may be really glad to see that officer, but you are in distress of some kind. So that citizen is starting from a position of they're unhappy in some way. And you take an inevitably negative interaction, and then you layer cultural misunderstandings, you layer on, you know, history of problems on top of that, and you have a situation that's difficult to navigate through. So then it takes you to go from community to communication. And I know we're not going to spend a whole lot of time, I think, talking about Ferguson, but I want to say that I have seldom seen such a mishandled communication situation from a public policy standpoint, from public officials, every one of whom I would give a failing grade to. But what many, many public officials have failed to realize is the change that social media has wrought, and how bad misinformation, how quickly bad information or misinformation can travel through a community and get amplified while police officials or mayors are still trying to figure out what actually has happened. And so we too quickly lose control of the mechanisms of communication. So then we fall back on that network. If you have people in the community that you can call, I mean, I expect my police chief in a crisis, he knows, depending on what happened and what community it is, he knows the 5 people he needs to get on the phone immediately to make sure that things calm down. The other thing that, in terms of communication, is that community was justifiably angry. You have to allow people to express that anger. You have to allow an opportunity to vent, to let some of the air out of the balloon, release some of the pressure. And obviously we all know that the right to public protest and civil disobedience is ours. And yet, and I think most big city police departments are trained in appropriate methods of handling that. But again, a lot of smaller police departments, they've never had big public demonstrations. They've never had to experience it, and they don't know. So there's a training element in there. And then when I said consistency, people have to know that there are clear policies, that those policies are enforced in every case, that there's transparency in the enforcement of those policies, whether that is discipline, whether that is training, whether that is how an incident is investigated, and that there is you build trust. You don't build trust in the crisis, you build trust over long periods of time, working consistently with the community.
So part of what I'm hearing all of you say, and certainly Mary, you kind of suspect the chief in Ferguson didn't have 5 names to call. It wasn't that he didn't think to do it. They just and so
I don't know either. I don't know either one.
We have no idea. But the part of what I'm hearing you all say is, in some ways, we've either mischaracterized or lost our way sometimes on how to think about community policing. We've kind of forgot the community part. And that, so some of it is, there are things that clearly are failures that most big city police departments don't. But we did have we had Staten Island. We have, the police turning their back on the mayor in New York City. I mean, we have remarkable incidents here. And of course, we also, here in Boston, just a couple of years ago, in this very place, we were sitting up and applauding for the extraordinary work that our police departments had done after the Boston bombing. And that combination has got to be a huge challenge. And so I'm hearing the beginnings of almost a return to the idea that it's more than policing. It's as you said, community building. Is that, I don't mean to put words in people's mouths, but can you give us a concrete example of what we might be different as you think about your strategies, each of you?
Well, the problem I have with this, not just this conversation, but what's been going on, is that it tends to, for lack of a better word, indict the entire profession and every city, and there's been no progress, and everyone lost sight of what's going on, and it's not true. But again, when you get these images over and over again, you got 24-hour news cycles, all you see are just repeats of the same thing over and over again. It certainly does give that impression. Now, that's not to say that there aren't issues, and there aren't some concerns, because there are very, very serious concerns. But policing may not be in as bad a shape as people think, but I think the larger society needs to be paying attention to what's going on, because it's more than just police. When you have some of the dissatisfaction, it's not just with police, it's with the system itself. It's frustration with an educational system that in many communities is just dysfunctional and not preparing people so that they can get jobs. It's frustration with people who have committed crime, gone to jail, come back out and would like to lead a different kind of life, can't find a job, can't vote, can't do any of the things that would help them regain full citizenship. And they get frustrated. And you have to eat every day, not wait 6 months to eat for somebody to decide to give you a job at McDonald's. So what are you going to do? You're going to go back to what you can do in order to support yourself and your family. So it's a vicious cycle that at some point has to be broken. Dysfunctional families, substance abuse, cops that have not been, we don't take into account the post-traumatic stress, not just with military, but with police officers who were exposed for years at a time with some of the dysfunction that goes on in many communities. And we catch people at their worst more often than not. and how do we take care of the police officers so they maintain balance. It's a complicated issue that in some regards is, you know, obviously it's at the forefront now and it's pretty bad. But in my opinion, this is an opportunity for us to do something to correct it, but just correcting what's wrong in police is not going to lead to any real long-term difference. It's not. And so until all of us want to face some hard truths and make real change in our communities, in a way in which government operates, in a way in which police operate, everybody taking a look to see what can I do better than what I'm doing right now, then we're going to be back here again in I don't know how long, but all we can do is take this thing from a boil back down to a simmer. And what we got to do is cool it off totally. And so this is an opportunity to do that. We'll see whether or not that happens.
And there's not a quick fix, because I
Right.
think a lot of folks say, oh, all we need is, if you put a body cam on every police officer out there and we will have hard video evidence. No. I mean, there's a whole range of legal issues around that evidence as well, but that's not a solution. It's a tool. And we all want quick fixes for this.
And you know, we all had 2 police officers dead in New York. You know, you were telling me a story about our cops hesitating too.
Well, listen, it can happen, and this has affected everyone. The story that he's referring to just before Thanksgiving, I had a couple of my officers working a wagon, and they pulled up on a robbery in progress, and as they were pulling up, the bad guy's coming out and he's armed. He fires at the car, hits the car a couple times. The officer gets out and he actually has a graze wound. It goes, I mean, he was just a fraction of an inch from it going right in his eye. And I saw him in the hospital, and they were able to return fire and neutralize the threat. But when he's in the hospital, he's saying the first thing he thought was about the Ferguson situation. Now, I mean, he's just very, very lucky. So it affects everybody in a different way. And I think it's time to just take a deep breath and start working toward fixing the problem, because there is a problem. I'm not saying it's not. Believe me. You know, I look around this audience, and with 1 or 2 exceptions, you know, I'm one of the older folks in the room here. If you haven't noticed, I am African American, and so it means I've been black longer than a lot of people in this room. So I have experienced a lot of this same stuff myself as a kid growing up, okay? And everybody's got their own story, and everybody's got their own thing and so forth. So it's not that I'm insensitive, but at the same time, it's the community that's got to rescue the community, not the police. And we got to look at some hard facts. If African Americans are 13% of the population, why are we 50% of the homicide victims in the United States? Why is that? Why is it that we have this concentration of poverty that tends to always be right in communities of color? How come we can't get that every generation of immigrants that's come to this country has been able to kind of lift themselves out of poverty, yet we seem to be stuck in neutral here and can't seem to, as a group, get out. So these are real social problems that have to be fixed. We're a part of the solution, but we're not the only part of it. And until we really look at everything, then again, it's going to be like Groundhog's Day. We're going to be doing this over and over and over again, and it's not really going to improve.
Yeah, when you talk about community policing or return to community policing, I would absolutely say no. That's not what we're looking for. I don't think that would be I don't really think that would be a step forward. In part because community policing used to be a return to Robert Peel's "the police are the public and the public are the police." But now it's not a noun; it's a verb. It's we community police, which is a thing. You've got a unit, you've got a box you can check, you got a CYA. Okay? And so I don't think that a return through that is the way to go, but I do think community accountability is the thing that we can get to. Right? And so let me give you sort of an example of the way that might work. If you're getting federally subsidized grants, as a police department, many police departments do, through JAG, burn type grants, you got to be accountable for that. So you have to report back to the federal government what it is you're doing with the federal government's money. And there are guidelines for what's appropriate to be doing with the money. And one of the first lines on the guidelines is, by the way, if you have an increase in drug-related arrests, please let us know that. That doesn't mean, right, that absolutely the federal government is encouraging that. It's just one of the lists of things you might be able to do. But if you're under time pressure and you're understaffed, not like any police department in the country, then you might end up listing that as one of the things that you've got. And that might trickle down to your first line supervisors and your line officers. Now, if I'm going to go out and I'm going to do some drug arrests, right, I'm going to do that as part of what I'm being held accountable to do to keep my job and to be able to promote, I'm not going to go into the house where people are smoking weed. I'm not going to go into the dorm room where folks are doing a line. I'm going to do it where there are people doing it in an open-air market. Police didn't set up the communities such that open-air markets happen in white neighborhoods. Police did not set up government redlining. Police did not set up the way in which tax dollars go to schools. Police are tasked with doing a set of things that the community has decided and their representatives have decided is a good idea to do. So when we talk about the ways in which the drug trade and the war on drugs connects to disparities, we're not talking about a policing problem. We're talking about policing statistics. That's not the same thing. So if we want to hold law enforcement accountable for the disparities that we see through that, please, let's talk about the housing components to it. Let's talk about the historical accuracies of it. Let's make sure that the people who are voting understand what they're voting for and the consequences of it. Let's improve our literacy on these issues. So when we're talking about a return to community policing, only if the community knows what the police do. Only if the community is racially literate and policing literate enough that they understand the consequences of their voting and policy actions. Because I think one of the most profound things in my experience as a researcher and sort of policy interventionist is when I heard for the first time a black police chief say, when the laws of this land were racist, whose job was it to enforce the law? That's not the police's fault that it was their job. That's the police's job that it was their job. So I want us to be more accountable for that as a group of communities, as opposed to just putting it all on law enforcement.
Mayor?
And yet the police still have to go out every day and do their job while all these problems continue to fester. And so you have to have, it has to be on two tracks. You have to have better tools and resources for police officers. You have to have better training for police officers in how to interact. When I was city controller, I did a performance review of our use of tasers. Every police officer in the city of Houston has a conductive electricity device, I think is what they're technically called, but brand name people are familiar with taser. And I looked at who across the department used them, how often they used them, and there was, of course, an interesting bell curve as to officers when they use their tasers. But then when you started drilling down, it was the younger officers much more prone to using tasers. Why is that? Well, one, it's an electronic device. Younger officers are more familiar with it. But older officers, you know, they had already established themselves in their careers before they got that piece of equipment. They had other tools and techniques for dealing with situations. Who used the tasers least? Female officers. And my opinion, and I didn't do the kind of research that Dr. Goff does, but is that a woman has already figured out that she's not going to muscle somebody to the ground. And she has figured out other strategies to de-escalate. And so giving officers not just another tool on their literal tool belt, but more tools for how to deal with the range of mental health issues that we have across communities. It's not just the issues of poverty and race. More and more, our officers are encountering people who are out of control on controlled substances. They have huge mental health issues, and if their first reaction is fear, it's going to be a bad encounter.
I really agree with what the mayor is saying. Training, education of officers is critically important. We do a good job in a police academy of teaching the technical aspects of policing. This kind of arrest requires this kind of report, and this is the statute that you cite, and blah, blah, blah. But very little, if any, in understanding your role in a democratic society, understanding, concepts like procedural justice, legitimacy, why that matters, the history that we have in policing in the United States, so you can put it in some kind of context as to why some people don't trust and for generations have not trusted police. I mean, you need to understand these things. We need to change also our performance measures in policing. We want cops to go out and do all this stuff, but what do? At the end of the day, it's did crime go up, did crime go down? And the only category that counts is homicide. I can have the best year in the world in Philadelphia. If my homicide's up, believe me. The Daily News and the Inquirer, that's going to be the story. It's not about how many relationships we developed with community, how many community meetings we've had, how many problems we've resolved. Our performance measures need to change. A friend of mine said something, and it was in the context of a lesson learned from all that's going on. And it made perfect sense, because we look at success in policing in terms of crime reduction or the absence of crime. And he said success isn't the absence of crime, it's in the presence of justice in a community. Think about that. That's what's going on. Crime rates are at the lowest level in decades, and people are upset. Why? Because they don't feel a presence of justice in these communities. We got to fix that. We've got to fix it. And we don't fix it through traditional policing methods. That's the problem, and that's the challenge.
Terrific. So there are microphones for people to come from the audience and ask questions of our panel. There's one right here, there's another one up here, a third one there, and a fourth one there. So please line up, and I suggest if there's a long line in one, go to one of the others, because I'll just go around the loop here. So why don't we start here? Let me just describe what makes for a good question here. The first thing is you identify yourself. The second is you keep it short. And the third is you end it with a question mark. So please go forward.
Thank you so much. My name is Dwayne Fender. I'm a joint degree candidate at the Kennedy School and the Business School. I really appreciate all of you coming here and making time. I think the question I have is, talked a lot about different strategies and tactics given what's happened. I think the question I have is, in light of, I think the mayor, you said if the first reaction is fear. I think first reactions a lot of times are based on implicit associations. And if someone looks at me, the first reaction could be fear, even though I'm wearing a Harvard joint tee, Patagonia, and I have a Harvard hat on, versus someone else who doesn't look like me. And so I'm interested in everybody's perspectives on what is going to be done if you have an all-white police force, if they look at a young African-American male or anybody else, if they're based on those implicit associations.
Phillip, you studied this explicitly.
Yeah, so about implicit associations, they're really hard to change. They come about not because people are bad, but because people are paying attention to the culture. For those who are not familiar with the phrase implicit association, is the automatic associations that you've got in your head. And if you believe that you don't have associations between groups and stereotypes, I've got a test that you can take. Everybody's got them. They're a part of a normal and universal human psychology. There are trainings that you can do to separate, not to reduce the bias, but to separate the bias from the behavior. Right? And I like to quote Jay Smooth. I call him a prophet, but he hosts a radio show in New York, who says that if somebody steals my wallet, I don't chase them down to find out whether or not they feel like a thief in their heart. I chase them down to get my wallet back. And that's what we have to do with the consequences of implicit bias, is hold people accountable for their behavior. One caveat on that. Any kind of attitude, and implicit bias is a kind of attitude, any kind of attitude is 10% of behavior at best. Your prejudices, if you say, I don't like that group of people, I don't like Catholics, I don't like black people, I don't like Latinos, I don't like police officers, that's 10% of behavior at best. What do I mean? I see a lot of furrowed brows. What do I mean by that? Anybody in here know anybody who they think of as a liar? Anybody? A couple folks? Yeah? Do they lie all the time? Now, a couple people saying yes, but you're married to them, so that doesn't count. They don't lie all the time, because if they did, we would call them opposite truth tellers, and they'd be the most reliable people we'd ever met. Okay? They lie when they're motivated to. They think they can get away with it, or when the consequences are small. You know who else lies when they're motivated to? They think they can get away with it, and the consequences are small? Everybody. Situations produce behavior, not character. So I appreciate the question. It's really important. We got to get trainings in that. But more than the trainings, we have to create policies that insulate people from the situations where their biases are in control, as opposed to the Constitution and the law.
And the other part of that, I think, when the doctor talks about training, self-awareness has got to become now part of regular police training, because you may not even be aware of some of the biases that you have. Now, how do you manage that? How do you not let that trickle over into what you do on a regular basis, so you can take steps to guard against it and make sure that what you're doing is engaging in real fair and impartial policing as opposed to being driven by other things. And I think that's important. We don't, when I say we, some departments no doubt probably do. The ones that I've been in, and we're in a process now of totally revamping our training, that is part of what we're looking at and we're instituting within our training.
Right over here.
Thank you, Dean Ellwood. My name is Michael McNally. I'm a second-year grad school at the Kennedy School. Grad student. I'm also from Houston, Texas. Mayor Parker, it's good to see you. I appreciate the comments about community development and relationship building. I'm wondering for a law enforcement agency where those resources are going to come from if community development is not related to enforcing the law.
Well, let me take a stab at that. We can't. We don't have anything in our budget to do it. That's why it's got to be much broader than just police. It's got to be buy-in at a lot of different levels to fix the problem. Can we be a big part of it in terms of getting it off the ground? Absolutely. We have a role to play. Can we totally support and sustain it? No, we can't. So it does take a lot of people sitting down and coming up with a real vision, a real strategy with the dollars behind it to invest where it needs to be invested if we want to have some kind of long-term or even short-term impact for that matter. It goes back to a point I made earlier. This isn't just about policing and just about police, because if we look at it that way, whatever recommendations our task force comes up with, okay, fine, these are things that we believe will be necessary in policing. Will it fix really fix what's wrong? No, it won't. It'll be a move in that direction, but it won't totally take care of many of the issues that we're confronted with.
Thank you.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay.
Hi, my name is George Karandinos. I'm a medical student here at Harvard and also an anthropology grad student. I grew up in Houston and I lived in Philadelphia and worked as an anthropologist there for 6 years. And my question is for Commissioner Ramsey. And I wanted to ask, over the years as a reform-minded commissioner, you've publicly expressed your frustration with the disciplinary processes in Philadelphia.
Yes.
And specifically with the pushback from the local police union. For example, in 2008, within 4 months of taking office, you had to deal with a national incident of police beating that was caught on camera. You fired several officers. They were reinstated subsequently. Also, more recently, in 2012, your decision to fire an officer who was caught on camera clearly assaulting an innocent woman during the Puerto Rican Day Parade was also overturned. Following that more recent decision, Mayor Nutter, District Attorney Williams joined you in expressing deep frustration with this outcome. And so as somebody who's worked in, was that?
Question we'd
Yeah,
love.
so
That'd
as
be
somebody
great.
who's worked in multiple cities at the highest level of the police department, I was wondering if you could address two questions, specifically from your experience in Philadelphia. One being, what are the institutional and local cultural challenges to reform that you've faced personally and that have been unique to Philadelphia? And how can we externally promote discipline in a police force like Philadelphia's when the police union is so effective in defeating disciplinary measures and protecting malfeasant police officers?
Nice, easy questions.
Well, let me talk about discipline in a broader context, okay? Part of the mixed messages that we send our officers, we want them to go out and we want them to engage in, procedural justice. We want them to do X, Y, Z with the community. And yet, internally, there is none. We are so punitive, the only thing we can think to do with somebody who does something wrong is suspend them or fire them. That's it. So if the goal is to really change behavior, what are options beyond that? And have internal procedural justice so that officers feel like they're getting a fair shake, which is going to change their attitude and their behavior and make them more inclined to do the same out there on the street. So is the arbitration system an issue? Yeah, I mean, there's no question about that, okay? But I'm not going to pretend as if I'm going to fix that, all right? The bottom line is we've got to think of a different way of approaching discipline and behavioral issues within our department. You know who really fixes problems within the police department ultimately in terms of discipline? It's not policy and procedure and all the punishment I can come up with. It's when we have a culture in policing where other cops stand up and say, we don't do that here. If we want community members to stand up and say, we don't tolerate this kind of stuff in our neighborhood, then we have to have the same attitude inside of police departments if we really want to stop misconduct. That's the only way you're going to make real progress in terms of changing the dynamic of things as it relates to how officers behave.
My police chief would say exactly the same thing about the arbitration process. But do you know who brings most complaints against police officers in the Houston Police Department? Other police officers. And that's what you want.
Right over here.
Thank you. My name is Ken Williams. I'm a retired homicide detective. One of the things that I did for a PD that I worked with here in Massachusetts, I ended up having to file what's called a False Claim Act lawsuit against them, a civil litigation regarding the grants that they received over the past 10 years under the False Claim Act. The doctor raised an interesting point, which is that when police agencies take federal money, they have to comport with anti-discrimination law. And once they have to comport with federal anti-discrimination law, the things that the people in the streets are complaining about is how do they hold the people that are they're paid for by taxpayer money, how do they hold them accountable? And for reform and justice and for accountability under the False Claim Act, when we're talking about in the past, since 1995, $15 billion being expended in the COPS grant program for hiring, for the militarization of police officers, the training mechanism has always been there. The problem is the accountability mechanism. It's been lacking. So under the False Claim Act case, and I suggest everyone look it up, it's United States, Ken Williams versus the city of Brockton, if you have a chance. We're now proceeding in federal court, and under this mechanism, it could become a class action lawsuit for all those police officers that are within the agencies that want to become whistleblowers, that have information that can resolve some of these long-standing disputes and conflicts between citizens and police, because we have some people, unfortunately, that are abusing their authority. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. Every agency, every business in the face of this earth has a certain percentage of people that will abuse their authority. So my question is this.
Good.
Yes. My question is this. Going over the CBAs, the MOAs, and the contracts, and the policies, and the practices, what would you say is, in terms of the internal mechanism for police officers to come forward, they often become retaliated against for their actions, for coming forward. What are you doing to provide safety to those officers that do come forward?
Is that for take it that's
for the panel?
Anybody?
Every department has to have internal processes to prevent that. It starts at the highest levels of the department. It starts with the training and oversight of your internal affairs division. You have to have the political leadership that supports that kind of a culture. I mean, I don't know how any of us could answer any other way.
Yeah, and until you get a critical mass of officers that really engage in that kind of behavior where they're not afraid to turn someone in. Houston's a good example. Then that starts to correct that. If you don't have critical mass, then it's just like asking one of your witnesses in that homicide who lives in a very troubled neighborhood to come forward and stand up and say that so-and-so is the one that did the shooting. But if the whole neighborhood stands up and says so-and-so did the shooting, it's a whole different dynamic at work. So you have to create that environment where you get that critical mass.
The only thing I would add to that are the chiefs, superintendents, commissioners, and sheriffs that have been successful have demoted and shuffled their command staff to reflect their values and to push those values downstream. So I mean, the critical mass is the key, but if the command staff is saying to other command staff and in front of rank and file officers and in the homicide unit and in IA, that's not how we do things, and the people who speak out get promoted, you'll see people change rather rapidly. If you change the incentive structure, you'll see the culture change. But in the academy, in any organization, any business, we don't have a way to protect whistleblowers that's more profound and more secure than changing the culture of the organization. And that's a long-standing thing to be able to do.
Thank you.
The folks up top
Oh,
there.
didn't see you up there, so why don't I go up there? Sorry.
My name is Erin Bauman, and I work with the SLEAD initiative here at the Kennedy School. Before moving back to the U.S., I lived in Ireland for 7 years and spent a significant portion of time in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, now the Police Service of Northern Ireland, underwent a massive reformation. And one of the biggest reforms that they actually made, one of the ones that was pushed most heavily by the community, was on pacification methods. And in particular, the move away from the use of threat and armed force through rubber bullets and water cannons towards actual pacification using kind of non-active phalanxes protected by shields. So I guess my question is it possible in your mind to think of reforming police pacification methods in the U.S. away from the use of threat and the use of force and towards something that would be based upon more pure pacification methods? And if it is, how can that be done?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer this directly or not, but there is a lot now, and the mayor had mentioned it earlier, about de-escalation and knowing that your action will cause a reaction. If you're on a front line of a demonstration, for an example, and if all the officers got their helmets on and riot gear, guess what you're going to get? A riot. And if you're out there dressed differently, and if you don't have the heavy equipment and all that sort of thing, then guess what you're going to probably get? A peaceful demonstration. So, I mean, we've learned that. And, I mean, I've been to Belfast. Duncan McCausland, who was the head of the police there, and I are very good friends, and he often talked about how at one point during the Troubles, in order to respond to a call, they really had to bring the military with them to respond to a call. In those same neighborhoods now, cops are riding mountain bikes and interacting with the community. So if it could happen there, then there's no reason why it can't happen here. And I think that most departments don't think that what you saw in Ferguson is a reflection of police departments across the country, because most chiefs, and at least the ones that I know, looked at that and kind of said, whoa, wait, you know, what's going on here, when they saw the initial reaction and deployment of people, of officers rather, during the initial demonstrations. That is not something that would have happened in most, certainly major cities. I don't know about some of the smaller ones, but certainly major. So yeah, the answer to your question hopefully is, yeah, we got to constantly reinforce that.
I would throw something else in, though, that America is awash in guns. And unlike most of Europe, you are going to have, that's just a fact. There are more guns in America, and you want your officers to understand the context, you want your officers to have de-escalation techniques, but you never want your officers to hesitate at the risk of their own lives. Period, end of sentence. And so that's a difference from some of those other places.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that the commissioner needs to catch an airplane to return to Philadelphia. He needs to quit at 7. It's
I can go about 10 after if you want to.
Okay, we'll go a couple of minutes over, but
as long as I have a ride.
we'll find a good way to get you to the airport. There we go.
Good evening. My name is Corey Tolbert. I manage security at the Harvard Business School. We've talked a lot about accountability from an internal standpoint, but we haven't talked a lot about accountability from the criminal justice standpoint. A big part of why people were so angry about what took place in Ferguson was not only, that the death happened in the first place, but that the grand jury process failed that community and failed the country in a lot of people's minds. So my question is, do we feel like the burden for police officer misconduct as it sort of morphs into potentially criminal action is too high, or so high that we're leading to police officers who are, outside of their training, killing people, and there's no recourse within the criminal justice system? Is that burden too high?
I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's the case. I mean, certainly these cases get highlighted, but when you look at the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of contacts and arrests that are made across this country by police that don't result in any kind of significant use of force, or certainly use of deadly force, then you have to rethink that, because it's just not, it's not accurate. Now, having said that, all it takes is one to really cause a problem. We have a unique responsibility and duty within society, and enormous power that and authority that we've been given, which, just as an aside, I'll mention it now because I'm over 60 and I tend to forget stuff real quick. But one of the other things that we don't do in policing is teach officers how to deal with power and authority that they've been given. You get some 19, 20-year-old kid and you bring him in the academy, you give him a badge, give him a gun and a Crown Vic can go 200 miles an hour, and then you wonder why you have issues if you don't take time to really help them better understand their role and all the things that go along with it. But I think that what this calls for is a commission to look at the entire system from start to finish, including all those things that Dr. Goff mentioned about educational systems, about social services, all these kinds of things. The last presidential commission that looked at the entire criminal justice system was in 1965 under President Lyndon Johnson. Most of you in this room may have read his name in a history book because you were not alive when that was done. It's time. It's time we take a look at crime in America, the future of policing and criminal justice in America, deal with all these issues. This task force will not be able to do all that. We got a piece of it, but we can't do it all. And when you're talking about grand juries, we don't do grand juries. And so there's so many different moving parts here that it's going to take a more comprehensive look than we could ever do in 90 days in order to really start getting a handle. And we got to tap into the talent, elected officials, researchers, and academics, community folk. I mean, there's so many people that could add value to that discussion, and we need to have it, and we need to have it pretty quick.
You touched on something. We made a change in the Houston Police Department in the 1990s. We raised the recruitment age to 21, and they required 60 hours of college. Complaints went way down. Just that extra maturity and that extra exposure and a little bit of education.
Yeah, we've got to 60 hours in 20 years of age. So a lot of departments have done that. But, you know, again, is that enough by itself? I think we need to really...
I don't want to lose the comment, though, because, you know, much of what energized this was actually after the criminal justice system did not perform what people thought was accountability. Now, I don't have enough knowledge or perspective to make specific judgments each time, but if you're talking about justice, and you use those words, and contrasted that with policing alone, doesn't the criminal justice system have to be just as much a part of how we think about this and reflect?
It does, and I think that's what Commissioner Ramsey was talking about. You need to look at this comprehensively, holistically, but do we want a system that we put our police officers in
harm's way?
We put our police officers in harm's way. We give them literally life and death authority over us. And we trust them to use it well. It's stacked in favor of the officer when they go in front of a grand jury because we have granted them that authority. And I wanted to ask you why you thought it failed. Because they didn't indict?
No, so I thought it failed for a number of reasons. The first is the system in and of itself. You have a prosecutor who can elect to use an entirely different process for that particular grand jury than he did with all the other cases that particular grand jury heard. That prosecutor is someone who works in that community, who relies on the testimony of police officers to be able to affect convictions in that particular community. So there's already an inherent bias in that relationship. And then when you look at the way that the evidence was presented to the grand jury, allowing people that you know to not have been a witness to that crime, to present false evidence, which is against the law, in fact, in Missouri.
You've articulated really well why it's not just about the result, but the process, and that goes to that consistency, a system where, in a case such as this, you use an independent prosecutor. A lot of cities are having that conversation about whether that's the appropriate method. You have to use the same process every time. That's part of the accountability and transparency.
Let me get in here because I feel the essence of the question, and I want to add a component to it. One of the ways that we have a difficulty dealing with racism and injustice today is that they took the darn signs off the water fountains. So now when it's going on, you don't have the immediate comparison. You don't say, you're getting treated this way because you are black. I rarely hear that from people, occasionally, but that's mostly from my mom. Okay? So because you only have the example that's in front of you, you don't have an audit of what the alternate is.
Yeah.
When I go into some police departments and we look at the disciplinary records, right, they have 5 years of complaints of racial profiling or racial discrimination and not one sustained case. I don't know whether or not that could possibly be true, but those numbers look funny to me compared to other departments where they have very few, but they have some. And none of those records are available for public research. So I hear that. When I go into communities, what they say is that the system failed us because there was a sense of injustice, regardless of what happened in that particular case, that resonated with their lived experience, not their perception, their experience of it. But I think the pushback should not be so much on the particular grand jury, the particular police department, or the particular shooting. It should be on the evidence that allows us to be informed consumers on what makes a suspicious amount of exonerations versus the appropriate amount. We don't have information. We don't have an evidence base for pursuing social justice.
There's a lack of trust. I mean, so whatever the outcome, there's a lack of trust, and it's understandable why people would not trust the system, and we have to restore that somehow. The solution isn't just getting rid of the grand jury process, though. And so we have to be careful about how we go about trying to fix something, because, you know, if not that, then what? Now, not every state or jurisdiction even has a grand jury process, but if not that, then what? And it's easy to say that, but we need to really carefully think these things through and not just have a knee-jerk response because of a few cases, and then we wind up with another issue that we've got to deal with.
Okay, I'm going to ask for one last short question. I do want to visit Philadelphia in the future and be on good terms with you, Commissioner. So I don't want you to, and traffic is a problem here.
Okay, thanks for waiting. Carmen Sirianni, I teach sociology at Brandeis, and I'm also a fellow at the Ash Center, and in fact have learned a great deal about community policing from some of my colleagues here. I was going to ask a slightly different question, but the Commissioner putting on the table this notion of a national commission seems to beg, like, let's see if we can fill that in more. And a couple things come to mind to me. One is how important it would be to not have a commission that is just 20 commissioners, an advisory group, meet twice in Washington, once in Chicago, go home, write your report, but that is connected to some vital conversations in communities with multiple stakeholders that have real issues with each other, so that the nation, which is crying out for some answers, can see what this kind of dialogue and what trust building might be like. That's absolutely critical to do some version of that. And secondly, and related to that, is we have so much good practice in different cities, is to also bring forward those people who have been very successful working across these boundaries, who have been paragons in the way they've done the training, the way they've done beat meetings and all this stuff, and make sure that's a central part of the conversation, that it's not just this critique, oh, we need some federal laws on, body cameras and all that stuff. I mean, if we don't do that, we're going to miss the opportunity that this raises, I would think.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And unlike 1965, we have social media. We're being live streamed right now. We have the capacity to reach everyone, not just in this country, but around the globe. If we don't take advantage of that and use that to our benefit to get input and to create dialogue, then shame on us. I'm not talking about closed-door sessions in Washington or wherever, and a handful of folks that are going to decide whatever. We have a tremendous opportunity to get input like never before, because this isn't 1965. This is the 21st century, and we have access, and we can leverage communication in a way in which it's just unparalleled, and that in itself is a springboard for future discussions and not falling out of touch again. Not letting that discussion and that dialogue die simply because we think we've resolved an issue. It's got to be continuous.
I would just add to the way you've asked that question is an insistence on procedural justice for an analysis of procedural justice in criminal justice. So very meta of you, and congratulations.
Last comment, Mayor? All right, well, this has been a terrific conversation, and thoughtful, nuanced, but also very much forward-looking. So first, I want to thank you all for being here. I also want to thank you for keeping us safe and helping us to think about a better future for us all, not only in policing, but actually in a democracy. These are huge challenges we face.
One quick thing, this discussion you're going to have next week is vitally important. Please participate. Those recommendations will come to the task force. I need to hear from you, okay? And it's like everything else. You know, if you don't participate and become an active partner, then don't sit around and beef about it later. Because you got an opportunity here. Please take advantage of it.
All right, thank you very much. That was terrific. Thank you so much. You were terrific.